We've all seen the movies. The fierce Viking warriors sailing across stormy seas, axes gleaming in the moonlight, descending upon unsuspecting coastal settlements in a blaze of glory and conquest. Hollywood loves to show us the raid itself, the dramatic clash of steel, the burning buildings, the triumphant warriors loading their ships with gold and silver treasures. We see the heroic last stands, the noble sacrifices, the warrior's code of honor. But what the cameras never capture is what happened after the fires died down. After the warriors sailed home with their spoils, after the cheering stopped and the mead halls fell silent. What happened to the women who survived? Specifically, what became of the noble women, queens, duchesses, abbesses, and aristocratic ladies who once held power, commanded respect, and lived lives of privilege and authority? The reality that archaeology and medieval chronicles reveal will shatter every romanticized notion you've ever held about Viking conquest. This isn't a story of honorable warriors respecting the nobility of their defeated enemies. This isn't a tale of political marriages and diplomatic solutions. This is the documented history of how an entire continent's female aristocracy was systematically transformed into commodities in what was essentially Europe's largest and most efficient slave trade, an economic engine that operated with ruthless precision for over 2 centuries. The question isn't whether this happened. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming, the written records are explicit, and the legal frameworks are preserved in excruciating detail. The question is how a civilization managed to build an entire economic infrastructure around the systematic degradation of women who had once ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and shaped the political landscape of medieval Europe. How did queens become breeding stock? How did abbesses become household slaves? How did the most powerful women in medieval society become anonymous entries in Viking account books? This isn't speculation or historical fiction. What we're about to uncover is documented, researched, and backed by evidence that spans multiple disciplines and sources. The physical proof comes from mass graves scattered across Ireland, England, and Scotland, particularly the haunting discoveries at Repton in Derbyshire, where over 300 skeletons tell a story of systematic processing and execution. The slave quarters uncovered at Dublin's Wood Quay reveal architectural evidence of industrial-scale human trafficking operations. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains has allowed archaeologists to trace the geographic origins of victims, revealing that women were transported thousands of miles from their homelands to die in foreign soil. The written evidence is equally damning and far more detailed than most people realize. The Annals of Ulster, written by Irish monks who witnessed these invasions firsthand, provide day-by-day accounts of what happened to captured nobility. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle documents not just the raids themselves, but the systematic targeting of royal households and the specific fates of named queens and princesses. Most revealing are the Icelandic legal codes, particularly the Gragas, which explicitly outline the legal status and treatment of different classes of slaves, including specific provisions for women of high birth who had been acquired through conquest. We also have the detailed first-hand accounts of Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan, who observed Viking slave markets in Eastern Europe and documented the prices, conditions, and treatment of captives with the precision of a modern investigative journalist. His writings reveal that Viking raiders didn't just take slaves opportunistically. They operated a sophisticated international trade network with established routes, standardized pricing, regular shipping schedules, and specialized markets for different types of human cargo. But perhaps most chilling is the evidence from the sagas themselves. The Laxdæla saga, the Egil saga, the Njals saga, and others that were written by the Vikings' own descendants. These texts, long celebrated as heroic literature and taught in universities as examples of medieval storytelling, actually contain detailed descriptions of what they euphemistically called acquiring women of worth, and the elaborate systems they developed for their systematic exploitation. When you read these sagas with an understanding of what the euphemisms actually meant, they become instruction manuals for organized human trafficking. The scale of this systematic targeting of noble women becomes clear when we examine the archaeological record from Dublin, which served as the epicenter of the Viking slave trade in the British Isles. Excavations at Wood Quay, conducted over several decades, have revealed holding facilities that could accommodate over 1,000 captives at any given time. But these weren't crude pens for random prisoners thrown together in desperate circumstances. The layout reveals a sophisticated classification system designed to sort, process, and prepare human beings for sale with the efficiency of a modern warehouse operation. The most telling discovery was a series of separate chambers, each with different amenities and security levels corresponding to the perceived value and escape risk of their occupants. Isotope analysis of teeth found in the highest security chambers revealed that these women had consumed diets rich in imported foods and expensive spices throughout their childhood and adolescence, the unmistakable dietary signature of European nobility. The chambers themselves were equipped with bronze mirrors, ivory combs, and silk fragments, not luxuries provided out of kindness, but tools used to maintain the captives' appearance and marketability for sale. Archaeological evidence reveals that these facilities operated year-round, not just during raiding season. Carbon dating of organic materials shows continuous occupation and regular renovation over periods spanning decades. This wasn't a temporary operation set up for occasional use. It was permanent infrastructure designed to support an ongoing industrial process. The economic records preserved in the Gragas reveal the cold mathematics behind the system, and the numbers are staggering. A noblewoman specifically defined as someone who had held land in her own right, commanded servants, or been married to a man of rank, was valued at 960 silver pieces. To put this in perspective that reveals just how valuable these women were considered, a skilled craftsman was worth 120 silver pieces, a farm laborer 80 pieces, a quality sword cost 200 pieces, and a fully equipped warship could be purchased for 800 pieces. A single captured queen or duchess was worth more than a warship, more than 8 times the value of the finest weapon a warrior could own. But the value wasn't just in the initial sale. The legal codes reveal that noble women were specifically prized for what the Vikings called bloodline breeding, a systematic program designed to produce children who could later claim legitimate inheritance rights to conquered territories. The Laxdæla saga describes this process in clinical detail. Captured queens and duchesses were forced into marriages with Viking jarls, and their children were raised with full knowledge of their maternal lineage, specifically so they could be used as political pawns to legitimize land claims decades later. The logistics of this system were staggering in their scope and sophistication. The Annals of Ulster record that in the year 914 alone, Viking fleets captured over 2,000 women of high station from Ireland and Britain. These weren't random raids conducted by opportunistic warriors looking for quick profit. They were coordinated military campaigns with specific targets, detailed intelligence gathering, and predetermined objectives. The chronicles describe Vikings using extensive intelligence networks to identify which monasteries housed noble abbesses, which castles held duchesses during their husbands' absences, and which royal courts could be struck when they were most vulnerable. The intelligence gathering was remarkably sophisticated. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements includes maps, genealogical charts, and what appear to be detailed dossiers on European noble families. These documents, preserved in bog conditions that prevented decay, reveal that Viking raiders maintained comprehensive records of European royal lineages, tracking marriages, births, deaths, and political alliances to identify the most valuable targets and optimal timing for raids. Archaeological evidence from Repton supports this systematic approach and reveals the industrial scale of the operation. The site contains the remains of what appears to be a temporary processing center where captives were sorted, evaluated, and prepared for transport. Among the hundreds of skeletons found, forensic analysis has identified at least 40 women whose bone structure, dental work, and dietary isotopes indicate noble birth. More disturbing, many of these remains show evidence of deliberate mutilation, not from combat injuries sustained during capture, but from what appears to be systematic torture designed to break psychological resistance and establish dominance. The forensic evidence tells a story of calculated brutality. Skeletal remains show specific patterns of healed fractures consistent with restraint injuries, malnutrition despite evidence of high-status childhood diet, and dental damage suggesting systematic physical abuse. Carbon dating reveals that many of these women survived months or even years in captivity before death, indicating prolonged suffering rather than quick execution. If you value this kind of deep dive documented history, hit that subscribe button. It's the single best way to keep this channel going. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The journey from capture to sale was a carefully orchestrated process designed to strip away every vestige of the women's former identity and status while maintaining their economic value. Chronicles describe how captured noblewomen were immediately stripped of all jewelry, clothing, and personal effects, not just for their monetary value, but as part of a psychological breaking process designed to destroy their sense of self-worth and social position. They were given rough wool tunics marked with iron brands that indicated their capture date, intended market destination, and current owner. The branding process itself was systematized with the efficiency of a modern inventory system. Archaeological analysis of iron implements found at processing sites reveals standardized shapes and sizes used to mark different categories of captives. The brands indicated not just ownership, but specific information about the captive's former status, estimated value, and intended use. Legal documents describe different symbols used to mark queens versus duchesses versus abbesses, allowing buyers to immediately assess a captive's background and potential value. The transport ships themselves were floating prisons designed with the same attention to security and efficiency as the land-based facilities. Archaeological remains of Viking vessels reveal specially constructed holds with iron rings set into the hull at regular intervals, ventilation systems that provided just enough air to keep captives alive during long voyages, and segregated compartments that prevented communication between different groups of prisoners. Skeletal remains found in ship burials show wear patterns on ankle and wrist bones, consistent with prolonged shackling, and chemical analysis of hair samples reveals the nutritional deficiencies that resulted from the minimal rations provided during transport. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan describes seeing these transport ships arrive in eastern markets with their human cargo, and noted that the women were kept in complete darkness for the entire journey to prevent them from learning the route or attempting escape. He also documented the systematic dehydration used to keep captives weak and compliant, the regular inspections to assess their physical condition and marketability, and the medical interventions used to treat injuries that might affect sale price, while ignoring injuries that wouldn't impact economic value. But the most systematic brutality was psychological, designed to destroy the captive's sense of identity and self-worth. The sagas describe a process called name death, the deliberate erasure of a captive's identity through the systematic removal of all connections to their former life. Noble women were forbidden from speaking their real names, mentioning their former titles, or referencing their family lineages. Violation of this rule resulted in severe physical punishment that escalated with each infraction until compliance was achieved. They were assigned new names, typically simple words denoting their intended function: weaver, cook, breeder, silver hair, tall one. The goal was to make them forget they had ever been anything other than property, to erase their memories of commanding armies, ruling territories, or making political decisions. Legal documents describe psychological techniques that would be recognizable to modern experts on trauma and mind control, isolation, sleep deprivation, alternating punishment and reward, and the systematic destruction of hope. The legal framework supporting this system was remarkably sophisticated and reveals the extent to which Viking society had institutionalized these practices. The Gragas contains an entire section devoted to the management of high-born captives, which reads like a manual for systematic psychological and physical control written by experts in human psychology. It specifies that noble women must be kept isolated from other captives to prevent them from organizing resistance or maintaining their sense of noble identity through mutual support. The legal codes outline mandatory daily humiliation rituals designed to reinforce the captive's powerlessness and their captor's absolute authority. These included forced public demonstrations of subservience, systematic degradation of any remaining symbols of their former status, and ritualized punishment for behaviors that had once been marks of nobility, such as attempting to give orders, walking with regal bearing, or refusing to perform menial tasks. The legal framework even provides detailed instructions for preventing suicide, apparently a common enough occurrence that specific legal provisions were necessary to protect owners' economic investments. The codes describe warning signs of suicidal ideation, preventive measures including constant surveillance and removal of potential weapons, and punishment protocols for unsuccessful suicide attempts that were designed to discourage future attempts while preserving the captive's market value. The economic infrastructure extended far beyond simple slave markets and reveals a level of organization that rivals modern commercial enterprises. Archaeological evidence reveals a network of specialized facilities across Viking territories, breeding compounds where captured noblewomen were forced to produce children, training centers where they were taught domestic skills to increase their market value, medical facilities where they received treatment to maintain their health and appearance, and holding facilities where they were kept until optimal market conditions arose. The breeding compounds represent perhaps the most systematic and calculated aspect of this entire operation. Archaeological excavations have revealed purpose-built facilities designed specifically for housing pregnant captives and raising their children. These compounds included medical areas staffed by skilled midwives, nurseries for infants organized by the status of their mothers, and training areas where children were raised according to Viking customs, while being told detailed stories about their maternal lineage. The pricing structure reveals the cold calculation behind every aspect of this trade, and the sophisticated market analysis that guided decision-making. The chronicles record that pregnant noblewomen commanded premium prices, but only if the father was known to be of Viking blood, and the pregnancy had been carefully documented to prevent disputes over paternity. Children born to noble captives were classified as half-thralls and occupied a specific legal category that allowed them to be used as diplomatic pawns while still being considered property that could be bought and sold. The market operated with the sophistication of a modern commodity exchange. Archaeological evidence includes what appear to be price lists, inventory records, and shipping manifests that document the systematic tracking of human cargo. These records show seasonal price variations based on supply and demand, premium pricing for captives with specific skills or bloodlines, and bulk discounts for large purchases by wealthy buyers. The international scope of this trade network was vast and reveals connections spanning the known medieval world. Archaeological evidence traces Viking slave routes from Ireland to Constantinople, from Scotland to Kiev, from Norway to North Africa. The Rus's trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire were essentially highways for human trafficking, with established stopping points, standardized exchange rates, regular shipping schedules, and diplomatic agreements that facilitated the movement of human cargo across international borders. Ibn Fadlan's accounts describe massive slave markets in Novgorod and Kiev, where hundreds of captured European noblewomen were sold to Byzantine and Arab buyers. The prices he records are staggering. A single Anglo-Saxon queen was sold for enough silver to purchase an entire farm, complete with livestock, equipment, and several years' worth of operating expenses. The buyers weren't just private individuals. They included royal courts seeking educated administrators, wealthy merchants needing household managers, and religious institutions requiring literate women for copying manuscripts. The specialization within this trade is perhaps most disturbing, and reveals the extent to which this had become a professional industry with defined market segments. Archaeological evidence suggests that different Viking groups focused on capturing specific types of noble women based on market demand and their own expertise. Some raiders specialized in abbesses and nuns, who commanded high prices in certain markets due to their literacy, administrative skills, and knowledge of Latin. Others focused on royal wives and daughters, who were valued for their potential to produce children with legitimate claims to thrones. The trade routes were organized around these specializations. Raiders who focused on religious women operated primarily around monasteries and convents, while those targeting royal families concentrated their efforts around political centers and royal residences. The timing of raids was coordinated with the ecclesiastical calendar and political events to maximize the likelihood of capturing high-value targets. The impact on European politics was profound and far-reaching. Entire royal lineages were effectively ended not through military defeat in battle, but through the systematic capture and enslavement of their women. The chronicles record multiple instances of kingdoms falling into chaos because their queens and princesses had been captured, leaving no clear line of succession and no way to form the political marriages that were essential to medieval diplomacy. The Vikings didn't just raid for immediate wealth. They deliberately targeted the reproductive and political power of their enemies with the strategic goal of destabilizing entire political systems. By removing the women who were essential to succession planning and diplomatic alliance building, they could weaken kingdoms without the need for prolonged military campaigns or the risks associated with direct confrontation with strong military forces. The documentation reveals that this wasn't random violence or opportunistic slaving conducted by individual warriors seeking personal profit. It was economic warfare conducted with military precision and strategic planning at the highest levels of Viking society. Viking raiders maintained detailed records of European royal families, tracking marriages, births, and political alliances to identify the most valuable targets and the optimal timing for their capture. They timed their raids to coincide with moments when noble women would be most vulnerable and when their capture would have maximum political impact. During religious festivals, when they might be traveling to monasteries with minimal guard. During harvest seasons, when their male protectors might be occupied with agricultural duties. During political negotiations, when royal households might be minimally guarded. And during periods of internal conflict, when kingdoms were distracted by civil war. The psychological warfare was equally systematic and strategically planned. The sagas describe how Vikings would deliberately leave survivors to spread word of what had happened to captured noblewomen. This created a climate of terror that often led to political capitulation without the need for direct military confrontation. Entire kingdoms would surrender and agree to pay tribute rather than risk having their queens and daughters subjected to the documented horrors of Viking captivity. The breeding programs reveal perhaps the most chilling and long-term aspect of this systematic operation. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows purpose-built compounds designed specifically to house pregnant captives and manage the systematic production of children. These facilities included medical areas staffed by skilled midwives who were trained in maintaining the health of both mothers and infants. Nurseries organized according to the status and potential value of the children, and educational facilities where children were raised according to specific protocols, designed to maximize their future utility. The legal codes specify in excruciating detail how children born to noble captives could be used as political weapons. A child whose mother had been a Scottish princess, for example, could later be used to justify Viking claims to Scottish territory, presented as a legitimate heir with royal blood despite having been raised in captivity. The chronicles record multiple instances of adult children of enslaved noblewomen being presented as legitimate heirs to thrones their mothers had been stolen from decades earlier. The systematic nature of this breeding program included detailed record keeping that tracked maternal lineage, documented paternity, and planned future political applications. Archaeological evidence includes genealogical charts that trace the bloodlines of captive women and their children across multiple generations, revealing long-term strategic planning that spanned decades. The scale of the genetic and cultural devastation is only now becoming clear through modern DNA analysis and archaeological science. Studies of medieval burial sites across Scandinavia reveal a significant influx of genetic material from across Europe during the Viking period. Genetic material that can be traced to specific regions that were targeted by Viking raids. These aren't the genetic signatures of voluntary migration or intermarriage between equals. They're the genetic signatures of systematic sexual exploitation conducted on a continental scale. The DNA evidence reveals family lineages that can be traced back to specific documented raids and identified captives. In some cases, modern genetic analysis has allowed researchers to connect skeletal remains found in Scandinavian burial sites to royal lineages documented in European chronicles, providing physical proof of the systematic capture and exploitation of noble bloodlines. The chroniclers often focus on individual stories of famous noblewomen whose fates were recorded because of their political importance. But the archaeological record reveals this was happening to hundreds, perhaps thousands of women whose names we'll never know and whose stories were never recorded. Mass graves across Ireland and Britain contain the remains of women whose bone structure, dental work, and dietary isotopes indicate noble birth, but whose deaths were so anonymous that they were buried without any marker of their former status or identity. These mass graves tell their own story of systematic brutality. Forensic analysis reveals that many of these women died not from disease or natural causes, but from injuries consistent with execution. The arrangement of the bodies and the presence of restraint marks suggest these were organized killings rather than deaths resulting from poor conditions or individual violence. The end of a noblewoman's life in Viking captivity was as systematically brutal as everything that preceded it. Legal codes specify that aging captives who could no longer work productively or bear children were to be killed rather than maintained as a drain on resources. Archaeological evidence suggests this was carried out with industrial efficiency. Mass graves contain clusters of older women's remains, showing identical trauma patterns, suggesting systematic execution rather than natural death. But perhaps most heartbreaking is the evidence of resistance and memory preservation that reveals the strength and determination of these women, even in the face of systematic attempts to destroy their identity. Hidden caches found in Viking settlements contain small objects, rings, crosses, pieces of fabric, carved bone fragments, that isotope analysis reveals came from the homelands of captured noblewomen. These weren't valuable enough to be worth preserving for economic reasons. They were kept as reminders of identity by women who refused to let their former selves die completely, even in the face of systematic attempts to erase their very existence. Some captives found ways to maintain connections to their former lives and preserve their memories despite the systematic efforts to destroy their identity. Archaeological evidence reveals hidden symbols carved into walls, pieces of jewelry modified to contain coded references to family lineages, and even evidence of secret writing systems used to communicate with other captives. The very existence of these artifacts proves that despite years of systematic brutalization, some of these women never stopped seeing themselves as the queens, duchesses, and abbesses they had been born to be. The resistance took many forms. The sagas occasionally let slip references to escape attempts, though they frame these as evidence of the captives' ingratitude and failure to appreciate their improved circumstances, rather than natural human responses to enslavement. Archaeological evidence suggests these escape attempts were more common than the written sources admit. Skeletal remains found in remote locations show signs of having survived capture and prolonged captivity, only to die during attempted flights to freedom. The international dimension of this trade created a diaspora of European noblewomen scattered across the medieval world, carrying their knowledge and skills to distant lands where their noble birth was remembered only as a source of their monetary value. Byzantine records mention Irish and Anglo-Saxon women serving in high-ranking household positions, their literacy and administrative skills making them valuable despite their slave status. Arab chroniclers describe European noblewomen in the courts of Baghdad and Cairo, their former royal status making them prized possessions, even in lands thousands of miles from their birthplaces. The economic records reveal that this trade was so profitable, it fundamentally shaped Viking society and became one of the primary drivers of Scandinavian prosperity during the Viking Age. Entire communities became dependent on the wealth generated by capturing and selling noblewomen. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic increase in luxury goods in Viking settlements during the height of this trade. Imported silk, precious metals, exotic spices, and sophisticated manufactured goods that could only have been purchased with the enormous profits generated by human trafficking. The legal framework became so sophisticated and comprehensive that it influenced the development of slavery laws across medieval Europe. The categories and classifications developed for captured noblewomen were adopted by other societies and continued to influence legal codes long after the Viking period ended. The systematic dehumanization pioneered in these slave markets became a template for later forms of organized oppression and provided a legal framework that was adapted for use against other vulnerable populations. The medical evidence reveals the physical toll of this systematic brutalization on the bodies of women who had once lived lives of privilege and comfort. Skeletal remains of women identified as former nobility show patterns of malnutrition despite access to adequate food supplies. Repeated physical trauma consistent with systematic abuse, and premature aging associated with prolonged severe stress. Many show evidence of multiple pregnancies despite living in captivity, confirming the chronicler's accounts of forced breeding programs and systematic sexual exploitation. The archaeological record also reveals evidence of cultural exchange, but not the romanticized version often portrayed in popular media and academic discussions of Viking cultural integration. Artifacts found in Viking settlements include items clearly made by captive noblewomen, illuminated manuscripts, fine embroidery, sophisticated metalwork, carved ivory, and other luxury goods. But these weren't collaborative cultural projects or evidence of peaceful cultural exchange. They were forced labor designed to increase the captive's economic value or to satisfy their captors' desires for luxury goods that demonstrated their wealth and status. The correspondence between Viking leaders and their international buyers reveals the global scope and systematic nature of this trade network. Letters preserved in Byzantine archives discuss the scheduling of shipments, the quality control of merchandise, and negotiations over pricing for specific categories of captives. The language used is identical to that found in records of trade in spices, textiles, or livestock. These women had been completely commodified and were discussed in purely economic terms without any recognition of their humanity. The impact on the children born to these captive noblewomen was profound and lasting, creating generations of people whose lives were shaped by their mothers' enslavement. Legal codes specify that these children occupied a liminal status, neither fully free nor completely enslaved. Archaeological evidence suggests many were raised in specialized facilities designed to train them for specific roles. The boys as warriors or administrators who could be used to legitimize Viking claims to conquered territories. The girls as the next generation of high-value captives whose noble bloodlines made them valuable in political marriages. The documentation reveals that some of these children grew up without ever knowing their mother's true identities or their own noble heritage. The systematic name death imposed on captive noblewomen meant that children might live their entire lives not knowing they were the descendants of queens and duchesses. Some legal documents refer to the discovery of noble bloodlines among adult slaves, suggesting that hidden noble ancestry was valuable enough to be worth investigating and documenting even years after the initial capture. The psychological impact on these children was systematically managed to maximize their utility, while preventing them from developing any sense of entitlement or connection to their maternal heritage. They were raised with stories about their mother's noble birth, but these stories were framed as evidence of their mother's pride and need for humbling rather than as sources of legitimate pride or claims to status. The end of this systematic enslavement came not through moral awakening or successful resistance, but through economic and political changes that made it less profitable and more difficult to sustain. The consolidation of European kingdoms under stronger central authorities made large-scale raiding more difficult and dangerous. The development of more sophisticated military technologies and defensive strategies reduced the Vikings' tactical advantages. The Christianization of Scandinavia created new legal and religious frameworks that, while still permitting slavery, placed restrictions on the treatment of baptized captives and provided legal grounds for resistance. The development of alternative trade routes reduced the economic importance of the slave markets that had sustained this trade. New sources of wealth, particularly the silver mines of Central Europe and the expansion of legitimate trade networks, provided alternative sources of prosperity that didn't require the massive investment in military infrastructure needed to sustain large-scale raiding operations. But the most chilling twist in this entire story is found in the archaeological record from the late Viking period, revealing that the system's efficiency eventually led to its own horrifying evolution. As traditional raiding became more difficult and dangerous, and as foreign targets became scarce or too well defended to attack profitably, the system that had been perfected for the systematic enslavement of foreign noblewomen began to consume itself. Skeletal remains from 11th and 12th century Scandinavian sites reveal that the same brutal methods once reserved for captured Irish queens and Anglo-Saxon duchesses were being applied to Scandinavian noblewomen whose families had fallen out of political favor, lost power struggles, or simply become inconvenient to their rivals. The infrastructure of systematic brutalization that had been built to exploit conquered peoples became a tool for internal political control and the elimination of domestic opposition. The legal codes that had been developed to manage foreign captives were adapted and expanded to deal with domestic political prisoners. The breeding programs that had been designed to produce half-Viking children with claims to foreign thrones were turned inward to eliminate rival bloodlines within Scandinavian society itself. The psychological techniques that had been perfected for breaking the spirits of foreign queens were applied to Scandinavian women, whose only crime was being born into families that had become politically inconvenient. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the end of the Viking period, the descendants of the very jarls who had built their wealth and power on enslaving foreign noblewomen were applying the same techniques to their own daughters, sisters, and wives. The system had become so efficient, so profitable, and so embedded in the legal and social structure of Viking society that it eventually turned its methods against the families of its creators. The same holding facilities that had once housed Irish and English captives were filled with Scandinavian noblewomen. The same breeding programs that had produced half-Viking claimants to foreign thrones were used to control and manipulate Scandinavian royal succession. The same systematic psychological torture that had been used to break foreign queens was applied to domestic rivals and their female relatives. What began as systematic economic warfare against foreign aristocracy ended as a tool of domestic oppression that consumed the very people who had created it. The noblewomen of 9th century Ireland and England who died in Viking captivity had their suffering replicated centuries later by Scandinavian women whose own ancestors had been their captors. The system had become a monster that eventually devoured its creators. This is the true legacy of the Viking Age that Hollywood will never show you. Not a tale of honorable warriors and glorious conquest, but the documentation of how an entire civilization built its prosperity on the systematic destruction of women who had once held the power to shape the political destiny of medieval Europe. The archaeological evidence, the legal codes, the chronicles, and the skeletal remains all tell the same story. A story of systematic brutalization that eventually consumed even those who had created it. In the end, The untold stories of noble women after Viking invasions break our hearts, not just because of the suffering they document, but because they reveal how efficiently human beings can systematize the destruction of human dignity, and how inevitably such systems turn against their creators when external targets become scarce. The women who died in Viking slave markets weren't just victims of historical brutality. They were the casualties of a system that ultimately proved no respecter of nationality, class, or family loyalty when profit and power were at stake.